didn't want to see her or ask to see her or anything? And so that initial time, did she see you put Shanann in the truck? So she was kind of following you? Okay. So she followed you and you put Shanann in the truck. Okay. And then what?
Cece wasn't up yet. She was just in her room. She was getting ready to get out of her bed. And then they were just walking around the house. I was put my lunchbox and stuff in the truck, and then grabbed the kids and I put them in the bench seat in the back.
Okay. And so Shanann, is she kind of on the floor in the back? And they're just on the bench? Okay. And both alive at that point? Okay. Is there any reason you would feel uncomfortable to tell me that they were not alive at that point? Okay.
It wasn't a video or anything?
It's hard to...
Losing time, I'm fading fast. I just wanna make it last. Try to let go of the past. I close my eyes, embrace the blast. Sleepless nights and headaches stack. Restlessness to hell and back. What's my purpose? What do I grab? A slippery surface, a heart attack. And sometimes you just gotta believe there's something that'll give you relief. There's something that...
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. This is the last episode in the 10-part What the F series. This is not going to be a long episode because I did a really long cycle this morning, 105 kilometers, so I'm not going to take too much of your Sunday. I hope you're enjoying your Sunday. Today we'll be dealing with the Trinastich surveillance footage. Interestingly, the district attorney incorrectly referred to it as doorbell footage in the sentencing hearing. Not sure how many of you caught that, but it's kind of interesting that he would I don't want to say misrepresent it, but sort of refer to it in the wrong way. There was doorbell footage, but that's not the footage that the neighbor provided. It was a motion camera situated in the alcove, which is a very different camera to a doorbell camera, and it's certainly not part of the door. When Chris Watts gave his confession in February 18, it was eventually conveyed to the public, and typically the public simply just seized on it as though it was gospel. And so I kind of got messages from certain people sort of saying, almost like in a taunting way, la 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 la, so you were wrong about this and you were wrong about that. And so one of them included a tweet on the 6th of March where someone let me know, and I quote, "There is video evidence that the girls went with him to the oil field alive." And when I got that tweet, I sort of thought, wow, is there breaking news somewhere? And I actually kind of conflated that with the Patrick Frazee case, because in the Patrick Frazee case there may be CCTV footage of him, I think, going through a drive-through. And now bear in mind is in a pickup truck, and so when he went to the drive-through, CCTV footage captured I think the contents of the rear of the pickup, and it looks like there's a bag and stuff in there. And I actually thought something like that had come to light. So when I got this particular message, I thought, oh, there's actual video evidence that the girls went with Chris Watts to the oil field alive. Of course, it turned out that there was nothing of the sort, and there still is nothing of the sort. There still is no video evidence that the girls went with him to the oil field alive. I hope that's I hope I'm not overstating it to say that. There is still no video evidence that the children were alive when they were taken to the oil site. With that being said, I have had to admit, and I've done so in a blog post published on March 6th, so I certainly didn't waste any time addressing this aspect, but I published a blog post. TCRS can't disprove shadows in the driveway were alive. Was Armchair Detective right all along? So so I think that certainly was a huge what the F moment for me and for True Crime Rocket Science. I had put forward a particular narrative all along, and then another narrative came along and I wasn't able to disprove it. And in this particular episode we're going to briefly deal with that, and we're going to deal with whether this aspect is a fact or a myth. One little clue is that this isn't the number one what the F moment the way it is for I think most people involved in this case. Most of the YouTubers basically hold this particular moment as the absolute number one, what the F of this whole case. It's the absolute undisputed sort of game changer, this particular moment on the video camera. And so we're going to be discussing that. If you've enjoyed this series, please subscribe, please like and share, please leave a comment. I will probably not be as prolific with the videos going into the rest of November. So, at this point I've been putting up around about a video a day. From here on out, that's not going to continue. I will obviously continue with the channel, but probably at a different pace. I'm also going to scale down my coverage of Chris Watts. I want to start working on the Kelsey Bereth case, which has already started. I want to follow that and cover that and study that and research that. I'm also going to do a book on that case, possibly by the end of November, but I reserve the right to take even longer. I kind of wouldn't mind just taking the month of November off from sort of hardcore research and writing. But if I feel fresh and good after 2 or 3 weeks, then I might start on Murder Most Foul, which is the book dealing with the Patrick Frazee case. I want to encourage the people who've read the Two-Face series to also follow me into this particular case, simply because we have an incredible opportunity to juxtapose Chris Watts to Patrick Frazee. How are they different? How was their premeditation different? Why did Patrick Frazee sort of why has he been so difficult to bring to trial? Why has it taken this long? Why is there so much uncertainty in the Patrick Frazee case compared to the Chris Watts case? And so on and so on. And so I think juxtaposing the two cases is going to be really, really interesting, and also seeing how difficult it is to bring a case to trial and then even get the result that you want. You also have an interesting situation where the witness in the Patrick Frazee case is interesting. I want to compare it to Nicole Kessinger. I'm not going to take it any further than that right now, but there's certainly a lot of parallels, some that are very similar and in some areas very different, very, very different. In any event, in this video, let's get back to the number 10 what the F moment in the Chris Watts case. Now, if you actually look at that particular title image, you can see how tiny that little keyhole is on the top left of the screen. It's literally probably less than 10% of the screen. And if you want to look at the details in it, the shadows under Watts's jeans or whatever, that's going down to another 10%. So it's sort of 1% of what you can really see there. And then it's also at night. and it's not necessarily high resolution footage. I do have a background in photography. I've worked as a magazine journalist for many years. I've worked as a photojournalist. I've edited a lot of photos, and that has helped me quite a lot in terms of investigating cases and then looking at CCTV footage, crime scene photos, other photos, and so on. And it's important to be able to see the nuances, but then not oversee them, not to imagine things that aren't there, to be able to literally see what you're seeing and not what you want to see. The Madeleine McCann case is a good example where there are some very questionable photographs, and there the metadata is actually very important. I've heard some people on YouTube talking about metadata. Metadata tends to have to do with the when you take a photograph, the camera provides you with things like the date, the focal lengths, the aperture, the type of camera that one is being used. That tends to be what the metadata refers to, not something else. Right. So let's just move along to, and I just want to come back to the dogs. We discussed the dogs in number 9, and I think what we saw with that was, we know for a fact that Shanann was killed in the house. We know that for a fact. That is what is known in true crime and in court cases, criminal cases, as common cause. In other words, everybody agrees on that. Chris Watts agrees that Shanann was killed in the house. Law enforcement agrees that Chris Watts was killed in the house. The FBI, everybody in this case agrees that Shanann died inside 2825 Saratoga Trail. And so we would expect a confirmation of this obvious thing from the cadaver dogs, and yet we don't have confirmation. It's also not accurate to say that the cadaver dogs disproved, like in an absolute way, that the cadaver dogs found no trace of a struggle or found no trace of anything suspicious in the house, and so that proves that Shanann wasn't murdered in the house. It's not one way or the other. It's sort of in between. It is the cadaver dogs showed interest in certain areas, and it's difficult to say what that means, right? To me, the more important aspect is that Chris Watts definitely cleaned his home. He definitely did the laundry. He definitely disposed of evidence, for example, in the trash. There were definitely vacuum tracks in the carpet, so something was definitely deposited in the carpet. He definitely picked up his wife's feces. He definitely cleaned up. And so the fact that the dogs didn't find something in an unambiguous way kind of makes sense. It makes sense that they sort of found something, but they also weren't absolutely certain. That if you tie that up with the cleaning of the crime scene, it makes sense that the dogs found something, but they were also frustrated by the covering up and the cleaning up of the crime scene. And I want to use the dogs as an analogy for the Trinastich video evidence. In other words, in the same way that we come tantalizingly close with the dogs, when you hear Chris Watts talking, the dogs bark, and it seems as though they're saying there's definitely something here, something definitely happened. I'm talking about on Tuesday when we knew nothing. It seemed as though the dogs were saying people died in this house, right? And it's true that they did, but we've got to be careful by being too biased and by sticky taping what we know happened in the future from that moment and sticky taping that in the past, right? We've got to be careful. And the same applies with the Trinastich video. in this case the bias is that people want to believe that what they are seeing is significant. In other words, when you see a little shadow that seems to be moving, you want it to be something meaningful and something sensational. Because what's the alternative? The alternative is that it's meaningless, that it's got no significance, that there's nothing to talk about, that there's no real, there's nothing that one can really do with this potentiality or possibility. And you heard in the segment provided right in the beginning when Chris Watts pertinently said, wasn't there video of children running around? The FBI agent cagily sort of answers, it's difficult to see. And that is the absolute answer. It is difficult to see. And in a court of law, if the prosecution used this evidence, they wouldn't really be able to prove anything. They wouldn't be able to prove anything either way. And in this sense it would favor Chris Watts, because whatever the prosecution said, he could dispute it and say, well, there's some doubt based on the video. So if the prosecution said the children were dead, he could have his lawyer claim that there was some doubt, possibly they were alive. That's what a clever elite lawyer would do in that situation. If the prosecution took the other line and said, well, look, we actually believe Chris, we believe that the children were alive, he could say, no, actually they weren't. And in that way undermine the prosecution and create doubt on the confidence they might have of the case. I'm just giving you the legal background. If we go to the Coloradoan, at the time they were saying that the neighbor's doorbell camera at about 5 a.m., which is ridiculously vague, it's not very accurate given what we know, but I guess the discovery hadn't come out then. Anyway, it refers to Chris Watts backing his truck into the driveway and going back into the house and out of the truck 3 times. You know about this. And then it says, likely as he loads the bodies. Rourke said, though the bodies can't be seen on the camera. Now this particular article came out on November 19, the day of the sentencing hearing, but also before the discovery was published. The discovery also made no mention of what you could see in the doorbell footage, and not only that, it provided there were no sort of screen grabs or sort of analysis of the Trinastich surveillance footage. Sorry, I think I referred to it as doorbell footage earlier. It's not doorbell footage. In any event, in this article from the Coloradoan on November 19, 2018, it's giving the mainstream media view and the view of the prosecution that likely Chris Watts was loading bodies even though they couldn't be seen on the camera, right? Now we know the very same publication kind of seemed to recant that by basically saying, when Rourke said, well, it seems that what Chris Watts is saying is corroborated by the surveillance footage, meaning it does look like someone is running around, right? So what I want to deal with here is the fact that Shanann had been killed in the house, and as I say, that's common cause. We know that for a fact. And so the question is, how come we don't see her body being loaded? Like, we know for a fact that Shanann was killed in the house. Why don't we see her being sort of dragged to the truck and sort of loaded into the truck? We know for a fact that happened, but why don't we see it? Does that mean she wasn't murdered in the house and she wasn't loaded into the truck? And this brings us to the dictionary definition of evidence. And I realize that this is necessary to convey to some people who are, I guess, unfamiliar with true crime. They're unfamiliar with criminal cases. They're unfamiliar with what happens in criminal courts. But in the real world, when you have something like this, you need to be able to tick the evidence box. Something is either evidence or it doesn't qualify as evidence. And so what is evidence? It's either the available body of facts or information indicating whether a belief or proposition is true or valid. I actually don't like that. I don't like that description at all. I don't like the contention that the available body of facts shows that a belief can be true or valid, because you can have any belief and then you can find facts and you can you can find information and you can find supporting evidence, but that does that prove that your belief is true or valid, right? So I prefer the synonyms for evidence, which are proof, confirmation, verification, substantiation, corroboration, affirmation, authentication, attestation, documentation, etc. Evidence is also something that shouldn't be subjective. So in other words, so one person might say, yeah, no, that is proof. You know, that's good enough for me. That's not proof. Proof is something that is incontestable. In other words, it's absolutely evidence of something. If you go to the verb version of evidence, it says to show evidence of, and then it says the quality of the bracelet as evidenced by the workmanship is exceptional. And then other synonyms: indicate, show, reveal, be evidence of, display, exhibit, manifest, denote, evince, signify, etc. Now, some people will say this video footage is evidence. It's evidence of a little girl running around, right? It's not. It would be evidence of a little girl running around if you could see a little girl running around. What is happening here is you're seeing a shadow, and people are saying that that shadow means it's a little girl, right? And if you listen to Watts' own description, he talks about, in his new version, this is version number 2, he talks about Bella was following him around and she saw him load Shanann into the car. If Bella was following her father around, why don't we see her following her father around? Many times he walked clearly sort of where the truck isn't in the way. Why don't we see children running one way and the other? Why don't we see the father carrying any of his children? Why don't they ever run around the wrong side of the truck? You know, why isn't there ever a unambiguous view, right? And so, just to be clear, evidence means something is irrefutably, definitely true. Evidence is not, I believe this very strongly, it looks accurate, and also thousands agree with me. That's not evidence. Evidence is absolutely clear. I want to emphasize this. Evidence is absolutely clear and demonstrably, self-evidently, scientifically authentic and accurate. In other words, when something is self-evident, it's a kind of thing where when you hold something up, everyone can see it, and it's self-evident. It doesn't need to be proved, doesn't need to be argued. Everybody knows what they're seeing, right? The problem with certain things that seem self-evident to some people is what is happening there is cognitive bias. And so, for example, if you look at the following image of a beautiful woman, the fact that I'm saying it's a beautiful woman is causing you to see a beautiful woman. On the other hand, if I'd said it's an old woman, you would have seen probably the old woman. That's how cognitive bias works. You are primed, something is suggested to you, and then you see what is being suggested. And it's particularly evident where something isn't clear. Then you tend to see what you want to see. Now, if we go to, there's a lot that I can go into here, and I'm not going to go into it in detail. But if we go to some of the night scenes of the Chris Watts house, you can see how shadows are sort of, and light sources, there are multiple light sources causing different kinds of shadows, diffuse shadows. You can also see in the image with the arrow going across the vehicle, you can see that there are two lines going up the center of the driveway. And you can imagine that from the side, if someone is, a shadow is falling on that line, it could actually look like it's filling up from the one side or the other, right? If we go to the image of Shanann, there's a very good example of how you see multiple shadows going in different directions at the same time. And when you watch the video, you can actually see how as she approaches the camera, her shadow swings around and it sort of swings forward. Someone said somewhere, I think it was on a YouTube comment, that can someone please explain to them how someone's shadow can move like in opposite directions. Well, there's an example. If you use different light sources, you can have shadows moving in funny ways, right? But I do want to be quite specific. I can't disprove that the whole shadows are dancing in the driveway thing. I can't disprove it, but neither can anybody prove that it absolutely was a person running around. That can't be proved either. And so I'm just going to refer to the final chapter in the epilogue book, book 9 in the Two-Face series. I'm just going to go through the first paragraph, maybe two paragraphs, because it deals it deals explicitly with the Trinastich surveillance footage. I'm only going to deal with it very, very briefly here. And the chapter is titled Monday Morning, August 13, 2018. To thine own self be true. William Shakespeare. When Christopher Watts emerges for the first time from his garage, 310 in neighbor security clip, he's wearing sneakers. At this point, he's heading to his F-250 work truck. Specifically, this point refers to approximately 05:17 in the morning. We can be reasonably sure of the time because the GPS activated at 05:18:02 and deactivated at 05:18:32. The 30-second period describes the movement of the truck from the road in front of the house to the driveway when Watts backed the rear edge of the vehicle just inside the garage. At 05:46 and 21 seconds, the truck eventually sidled down the driveway and made its way out of the neighborhood and onto the highway. Curiously, the Vivint sensor showed the garage door was left open at 05:27, exactly 10 minutes after we see Watts on Trisnastich's surveillance camera. The security system also showed the basement door leading from the ground floor level down to the basement, and I'm not going to read further than that. What was important to address in the narratives, and particularly in epilogue, was to once and for all go through the Trinastich surveillance footage and cross-reference that with GPS data, also with the Vivint sensors, and then also try to visualize what Watts was doing when he was going inside and what he was doing when he was going outside, and then catching him every single time that he appeared. And what was he doing? What was he carrying? And the fact that he could possibly have been carrying 3 bodies. How can we link that up to the footage? And again, we don't want to have cognitive bias. We don't want to see things that we shouldn't be seeing, but we also want to link up our case. We want to see if there's evidence backing up our theory. And so the final chapter in the Two-Face series deals explicitly with the surveillance footage, and it reimagines what we're not seeing. It reimagines what's going into the house, what he's doing in the house, which sensors are going off, and where everything is, and what is exactly happening with the various people. You know, how is he packing the truck? What is he packing? What is he doing? And then just to dip into the quote that I used in that chapter, it is not for nothing that I used Shakespeare's "To thine own self be true," meaning when you're looking at this, be true to yourself. Don't listen to what other people are saying. Don't be influenced. Try to see reality. Try to see what is in front of you. Don't try to see what you want to see. Try to see what is there. And this brings us to the number 10, what the F. I mean, the thing that I guess shocked me the most with the Trinastich surveillance video was that it was basically useless. You don't really see anything other than the fact that Watts is busy at that time of the morning. So in terms of smoking gun, it wasn't. In terms of inculpatory evidence, it wasn't exactly convincing. You might know inculpatory evidence is evidence that shows or tends to show a person's involvement in an act, or that can establish guilt. The video didn't necessarily do that. It did provide a link to show how the bodies may have gotten from the house, well, in fact did get from the house to the well site, but it certainly wasn't showing anything in an explicit way. One would know that via inference. So the fact that the video was so of dubious quality and of very poor clarity was quite a shock to me. The irony is the video that to me was so inferior and not very useful has been incredibly useful to conspiracy theorists and I guess YouTubers who've conjured whatever they want to with it. Which brings us at last to a moment of truth, and this is kind of divorced from the number 10, what the F. What I want you to do is clear your mind. I'm putting on a white slide, and I want you to just clear your mind of bias and of everything, and I just want you to imagine. Now, I've heard some people saying how useless imagination and intuition and whatever is in true crime. It's actually the opposite. If you use it properly, it's an invaluable tool. It helps us to see into a crime, but of course it relies on your ability to see reality, and that's what we're going to try and do now. So very briefly, what I want you to do is imagine that you are Chris Watts and you believe that you haven't killed your wife, right? So when you're telling your story to the media, to other people, to Kissinger, whoever, whether it's whoever you're telling your story to, what you're telling them is at the same time your family have disappeared, you don't know where they are, and at the same time, this is very important, simultaneous to that disappearance, you have decided to move out. Now, again, what I want you to do is forget about what happened to the children and to Shanann. Pretend that the crime is completely irrelevant. The only relevance the crime has in this hypothesis is that it corresponds, it's simultaneous to, it's coincidental to this whole idea of moving out. Okay, do you agree with that? I want to give you a few seconds just to try and imagine the situation, which is Chris Watts, in his mind, you need to get into his mind, not into your mind. And in his mind, you've got to lie to yourself and believe that Shanann has just disappeared. She's somewhere else. She's still alive. The children are also just somewhere else, still alive, and they're out of the picture, right? And at the same time, in terms of the scenario, you want to move out. You know that they're contingent on one another, right? I just want you to sit with that for a few seconds. You might need to replay this video again just to follow what I'm trying to get at. If you are following, then we go to the next step and we say, if Watts didn't have access to the finances, why was it so urgent to sell the house that Monday? Why was it so urgent that his first call was to Primrose? Why was his second call to the realtor? Now obviously in our minds we're projecting back and we know that the family disappeared, but if you just move that aside for a moment, Watts is woken up on Monday morning and it's suddenly very important that he sell the house, that they move, that the children get taken out of Primrose, and that he calls the realtor and gets this whole show on the road. Again, the question is, if Watts didn't have access to the finances, why was it so urgent to do it that day? How come Watts wanted to do it that day? How come he knew he had to do it that day? And I believe the answer is Watts did have access to the finances. He did know how serious the situation was. But Shanann was in control of the finances, and a big part of killing her and getting rid of the family was so that he could access the finances. It wasn't that he didn't have knowledge of the finances. It wasn't that he didn't even have access to the finances. It was he had no control over them while Shanann was alive. And so in his mind, they had to disappear in order for him to regain control. And regaining control over his finances meant regaining control over his life. If you followed that, then we can go into the next step, which is to say, Watts was ashamed of what he did to his family. That's why he hasn't been able to admit, still, even today, across all three versions, he hasn't been able to admit exactly what he did. But guess what? He's more ashamed of his financial situation, his true financial situation. He's more ashamed of his finances than of wiping out his family. And this is true with some men with regard to some women. Some men know that they are attractive to some woman based on how much money they have, and so if they don't have any money, if they are broke, a woman's not going to show any interest in them. And so with Chris Watts, and this is an aspect not addressed I think by anyone, is you have a situation of he's ashamed of what he did to his family, but he did to his family what he did because he was even more ashamed of his financial situation. And why is that? Because he was out of Kessinger's league. He grew up poor. And the fact that he's in jail proves he was never good enough for Shanann either. He lived a lie for so long, even he was starting to believe it. Thank you for listening.